Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a brand new video. My name is Arfat. In today's video, I'd like to share with you a read from a book that is edited by the late Professor Jimmy Dunn or James D.G. Dunn. This is Paul and the Mosaic Law. Paul and the Mosaic Law by James D.G. Dunn. This is published by, I always can't pronounce the first one, With and Stock. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, With and Stock. And this is a chapter written by Martin Hengel, and this is from page 28, and this is the conversion of the persecutor en route to Damascus and their theological consequences. As you can see here. Alright, page 33. So let's begin, inshallah. Prior to this transformation in his life, Paul had been a young and ambitious Pharisaic student in Jerusalem. He tells us this convincingly in Galatians 1, in Philemon 3, chapter 3, in 1 Corinthians 15, and in Romans 15. Before AD 70, or before 70 CE, there were no such individuals as diaspora Pharisees with their own Hellenistic seminaries. A strict observance of the Torah and its exact investigation were possible only within the Holy Land. Excuse me. For many of the commandments could not be followed elsewhere, because you need a temple, so on and so forth. And the temple is only in Palestine. In Jerusalem, Paul persecuted the Jewish Christian group of Hellenists. He made it his aim to drive them out of the city. Whether there was a persecution in Antioch, conjectured from a combination of Galatians 1:17 and 22, seems to be highly unlikely. So it is highly unlikely that there was any persecution in Antioch. Only 3 years after the Passion, it could hardly be explained historically. Luke gives an excellent account of what took place. Paul went to Damascus in pursuit of the adherents of the new sect, the Hellenists who had fled there from Jerusalem. He was motivated by a zeal for the law which the new sect had trodden underfoot by blasphemously invoking and extolling a crucified seducer, who had been a curse, as the Messiah and Son of God, who was now honored at the right hand of God, and who was now awaited as the Son of Man and Judge of the world, who would come empowered of God. This basically means Jesus. The offense of such blasphemous views was aggravated by the fact that the Hellenists were critical of some parts of the law. They also were thought to reject the sacrificial temple cultus, for the sacrificial death of Jesus had made the temple and its offering obsolete. The motives all point back to Jerusalem. At the same time, the Hellenists did not engage in any basic soteriological criticism of the law, such as those of Paul himself. Their own motives seem to have been in matters of detail. Hence, we should not speak of a preaching that was free from the law, as I myself used to do, Martin Hengel used to do. Bismillah. At root, there never was such a thing in early Christianity in any strict sense, not even in Paul. The first commandment of the law of love and the 10 commandments all had a central role in Paul's preaching. There was no real antinomian, anti-law, meaning you are against the law, antinomian, though he was perhaps misunderstood as such in Corinth. He had to contradict this view. The view espoused in 1 Corinthians 9, Galatians 6, Romans 13, and Galatians 5. The problem was that of relating saving faith to God's command, the grace of God and our own works. In what follows, I shall speak only of criticism of the law, not of freedom from it. Approaching Damascus, Paul had a direct vision of the risen Lord Jesus. Okay? He refers to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and chapter 15. In my view, the three Lucan versions in chapters 9, 22, and 26, okay, there's a different, the Lucan, meaning the encounter of Paul, okay, as mentioned in Acts, in chapter 9, chapter 22, and chapter 26, they all varies. Okay, if you read them in details, they all varies. In my view, the three Lucan versions in chapter 9, 22, and 26 rest on the fact that Luke himself had heard the narratives on three occasions. Common to all was the vision of the heavenly, okay, Lord of the risen heavenly of the risen Lord that threw down and blinded the persecutor. Okay, the heavenly grace and of the risen Lord that threw down the blinded the persecutor Paul, because he used to persecute Christians in Antioch, okay, which was highly doubtful. And then the audition that made Saul into Paul. Okay. If you're not familiar with these narratives in the book of Acts, basically Paul was on the way to Damascus, and then he suddenly saw a light that blinded him, right? And later on, he mentioned that this is actually the risen Lord, which is Jesus, okay, according to the book of Acts. And so Paul was blinded by this, and he recovered his sight 3 days later. Okay. We are reminded, okay, of the accounts in Romans chapter 5, which, like the formula of the justification of the ungodly in Romans 4, has universal application, yet which applied specifically to Paul, the enemy thus far of the Son of God. Paul is said in 1 Timothy 1:15, okay, to be the one of the sinners who have been saved by the coming of Christ into the world. The former persecutor was now a paradigm of unmerited grace. It basically means now he used to be the one who persecute most probably Jewish Christians, right? And so now he was the one who actually in need of salvation. Okay. Paul's own account of his calling in Galatians 1:16 ties together the election, the revelation of Christ, and the mission to the Gentiles. As in Luke, vision and audition are linked. Okay. The surprising transformation of Paul, which had all the directness of the calling of the prophets, had corresponding and equally urgent consequences. Paul did not have to wait upon other authorities that had already been given an apostolic commission. Okay, basically, he was assigned to persecute Christians in Antioch. Okay, put it in a nutshell. But as far as historical account goes, we don't know if this is actually the case, because the priest or the owner of the Sanhedrin, the head of the Sanhedrin in Palestine, have no authority to order Paul or basically any zealots, so to speak, or any Jews to persecute Christians in a different town, different country, so to speak, right? The Sanhedrin, the head of the head priest or the temple guards or whatsoever, do not have authority to order someone to go and persecute other people in a different country, so to speak, right? It's just like modern day, a policeman in my country can't cross the border and catch a thief in a different country, right? So that is the same concept here. Okay, so which is why historically it is a bit problematic, because Paul was sent to persecute Christians in Antioch. And by Christians, I don't mean modern Christians. I mean Jews who accepted Jesus as the Lord, as their Messiah, basically. Not Lord, but as their Messiah, as their Christ. Okay? And these Jews still believe in the law, and these Jews believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And some of the laws that have been abrogated, for example, Matthew, right, the antithetical law, for example, which actually not change the law but make the law even tighter, right? You make the law even much more difficult to follow, and you can see in Paul's letters, authentic letters, that he actually knew about this or probably knew about this, and so he decided to challenge, especially the law of circumcision, right? And so, most probably, Paul account whereby he go and persecute Christians in Antioch is actually not historical, or at least it could have happened, but it is definitely not ordained officially by the head priest or by the Sanhedrin. Okay? The surprising transformation of Paul, which had all the directness of the calling of the prophets. Okay, this is also a very important statement, because if you actually study Paul, and there are a couple of good books which inshallah I will try to recommend, Paul tries to mimic, at least according to him, the letters that he wrote. He tried to portray himself as a prophet, an anbiya of God. And the stories of the prophets, the major and minor prophets in the Tanakh, the Navi'im, is somewhat similar to, especially the story of the calling of the prophets. Okay? And some scholars actually try to portray that Paul is jealous that he should have been the prophet, he should have been the Messiah, right? And so he tries to put himself in a position, at least based on his letters, whereby he portrays himself as someone that is actually a prophet, right? Because he went to communities in Asia Minor, he went to Corinth, and then, for example, in Galatians, right? He, especially Galatians and Corinthians, 2 Corinthians especially. By the way, 2 Corinthians are divided by two. Most scholars say are of the opinions that it is divided by two. Chapter 10 to 13 is a separate letter than chapter 1 to 9, chapters 1 to 9. The angry letter and the consolatory letter, right? And so Paul tried to portray himself as a prophet, so to speak, that got upset and then threatened the community that he actually went to evangelize, right? And say that if you don't listen to me, right, these super apostles, these men from James, okay, from Palestine, from Jerusalem, okay, I'm preaching to you that you do not need to be circumcised. Okay, and the law of the Old Testament, especially in Romans, will only lead you to sin, right? And you should accept Jesus dying for your sin, right? Especially his very profound statement, all right? If you don't accept Jesus dying for your sin, then basically there's nothing else that I can do with you, right? And so all these kind of things, the upset Paul is what I would call it, right? The upset Paul, but he's upset most probably because he wasn't chosen to be the prophetess, to be the prophets. And so because of that, so according to some theories, he go around the Mediterranean, trying to destroy the teachings of Jesus, because ironically, according to the Gospels, right, Jesus went around his ministry anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Right? If you include John, there are 3 occasions of the time where Jesus went to Jerusalem for the Passover, right? And it's held yearly. And so anywhere from 1 to 3 years, the ministry of Jesus lasted. But either way, for all these years, he taught his disciples certain things, only for Paul to come 10 or so years later and change it. So it doesn't make sense to me, right? By the way, we will carry on here. He went at once to Arabia, to the country of the Nabateans, to proclaim the gospel there that he had received by revelation from the risen Lord. Okay. Paul claimed that he received revelation, he received wahi from Jesus, basically. In the final account in Acts 26, Luke presents his own understanding of the Damascus encounter with Christ. He links inseparably the vision of Christ, election, and the mission to the Gentiles. In the first 2 accounts, in chapters 9 and 22, a certain mediatorial role is given to Ananias, who is undoubtedly a historical figure. By baptism, Ananias receives Paul into the early Jewish Christian community. We can learn from Romans that Paul was baptized. By no means was he an unbaptized preacher of the gospel to the nation. Okay? I'll clarify what gospel here means. That it doesn't mean the gospel in the New Testament, though he does say later that he seldom administered baptism himself. Okay? So, if you can say the gospel that when scholars say Paul's gospel, there are 2 things. They mostly refers to the book of Romans, right? And the other thing is that it is in reference to the teachings of Paul, that is in contrary to the teachings of Jesus, in accordance to the actual New Testament gospel. Okay. It is noteworthy that Luke says nothing about the community instructing Saul or Paul in the gospel, not even when he mentions his visit to Jerusalem. There, Paul told the apostles about the Damascus meeting and his open testimony to the name of Jesus. It is obvious from Luke that Paul's proclamation of the gospel was in no way dependent upon the Jerusalem authorities, the people of James, okay, who is the head of the church in Jerusalem after Jesus. Okay, James also the brother of Jesus, okay, at least according to Christian tradition. The Roman Catholics, by the way, don't believe that Jesus had a brother, right? Because they believe Maryam alayhi salam remains a virgin. And this is the majority of the opinions of the Muslim scholars. Okay? Though there are in the fringes some scholars indicating that sure, it is definitely true, because the Quran mentioned that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a virgin. Okay, but some of these scholars say that doesn't mean that she remained a virgin her entire life. Okay, so this is not so important, in fact not even an important point to discuss, because whether Mary, the mother of Jesus, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon her, remains a virgin or not, it doesn't have anything to do with our theology. And so some people, they go into all these unnecessary methods which doesn't actually do anything much at all, right? So either way, it is obvious from Luke that Paul's proclamation of the gospel was in no way dependent upon the Jerusalem authorities. Basically, Paul himself mentioned that he did not get this revelation from anyone else but the risen Lord. Okay. And so his teachings comes from Jesus directly, not from the men of James, not from the Jerusalem apostles, okay, not from the super apostles. Okay. Quite the contrary. Here's what Martin Hengel expressed. The only problem is that the preaching of the converted persecutor, basically Paul, is presented only in generally is presented generally only in Christological terms. I changed the sentence a little bit here because to make it much more meaningful. For example, Jesus is the Son of God or Messiah, according to Acts chapter 9, verse 20. And that Paul preaches only to the Jews in the synagogues. Okay? And so what Martin Hengel here is trying to make is that whatever Paul mentions about himself, for example, how he began his ministry and whatever the book of Acts mentioned, a lot of scholars believe that the book of Acts was written by Luke, though the opinions are starting to shift. Okay, but by unanimous consensus, the author of Luke also authored the book of Acts, okay? Which is why Martin Hengel uses Luke, because he, and as well as many other scholars, believe that Luke also authored the book of Acts, right? And so Luke basically, the book of Acts basically mentions the ministry of Paul, how Paul began his ministry, quite differently than how Paul actually mentions about it himself. For example, okay, for example, Paul's in the book of Acts, okay, Paul went to synagogues. First, he preached to the Jews, and then when the Jews do not want to accept his message, he'll move on, so on and so forth. Okay. Whereas in Paul's actual letters in First Thessalonians, and as well as his other genuine letters, he actually set up shops and actually preached the message of the gospel, okay, his own gospel, to people who actually came by his shop. He was a leather worker. Okay, some people say he was a tent maker, but he was actually someone who deals with leather, not necessarily tent. Okay, in fact, the translation that Paul was a tent maker is actually not correct. He has something to do with leather. Okay, working with leather, so to speak. And so Paul would actually preach, right? And then he would move to a different town. He would repeat the same thing, we suppose, based on his letters, right? So the book of Acts and the original letters of Paul, by original I mean, I should have used the word authentic letters of Paul, not original. Right? The authentic letters of Paul, according to what scholars believe, there are 7 of them. Paul actually preached to those people who came to visit his shop, right? Because he has to make a living. Right? So what Martin Hengel here is trying to make is, in fact, it is to the contrary. Okay. Luke shows no understanding of the specificity of the Pauline gospel as the word of the cross. Okay, meaning this is also a point here. There's so many tangents that I can go to. I'll never be able to finish this part. Luke doesn't show any understanding of Paul's ministry. In fact, Luke contradicts Paul's actual letters. So this is actually a dig to those who claim that Luke was the author of Luke Acts, was actually the companion of Paul because of the wee passages found in Acts. Okay, but that's for a separate video. So if Luke, the historical Luke, and scholars believe that there are a historical quote-unquote Luke who actually travels with Paul, and then halfway he stopped. If this historical Luke actually wrote the book of Acts, or Luke Acts, then why did he show no understanding of the ministry or even the gospel of Paul. Okay. Paul's teaching, Paul's ideas, how he began his ministry. Why are there so many contradictions in the book of Acts describing Paul and what Paul describes about himself? Right? So this is a dig at those who believe that the historical Luke actually wrote Luke Acts. Okay. Luke shows no understanding of the specificity of the Pauline gospel as the word of the cross, of the tension between gospel and law, or of the view that fallen sinners are referred only to grace. Okay. He certainly does not express these features. This is perhaps his theological weakness. Yet in all three accounts he lays increasing stress upon the fact that Paul is a chosen instrument to take the gospel to the Gentiles. This is stated by Ananias in chapter 9 verse 15 of the book of Acts, more strongly by Ananias in chapter 22 verse 15 of the book of Acts, and most strongly of all in chapter 26 of the book of Acts, in the saying of the risen Lord to Paul. The final depiction is the culminating point for Luke, but he still does not grasp the depth of Paul's Christology and anthropology, and might even have rejected Paul's radicalism. Okay. Now, I'll stop here and I'll go into a tangent. Okay. So, obviously, there are so many other portions here which we will have to. It's very important that we actually go through this some other time, inshallah. But kind of a tangent to end the video is that the gospel of Paul and the gospel that the author of Luke wrote, Luke Acts, right? And I'll read to you the point again here. Okay, the final depiction is the culminating point for Luke, but he still does not grasp the depth of Paul's Christology and anthropology, right? But that is not the point here. The point is, and Luke might even have rejected Paul's radicalism, right? Paul's radicalism, in what sense, right? If you know about the history or the theory, actually, of the source, the two source theory, okay, whereby we have a Q, we have Markan materials, okay, and then Luke and Matthew uses Mark and also uses Q, right? And Mark was heavily influenced by Paul, not so much the Q materials, right? So imagine that I'm the author of Luke Acts, and I have Mark as my source, and Mark has been heavily influenced by Paul. Whether Luke knew that or not is besides the point. And then a separate source here, Q, which Luke has access to, right, if we follow the two source theory, right? And Luke has these sources coming down to him from Mark, and Luke has these sources coming down to him from Q, right? And so, and Luke most probably aware of Paul's writings, if you want to add that into the picture. But either way, even whether Luke knew or doesn't knew is besides the point, because Mark has been heavily influenced by Paul, right? And if you actually study Luke and Mark comparatively, Luke changes Mark the most. Right? If you compare Matthew, Luke, and Mark, Matthew followed 90% of Mark, but Luke changes a lot of Mark. So the point that Martin Hengel here is trying to make, and he definitely has this at the back of his mind, is that Luke rejected some of the theories of Paul that have crept through Mark and accepted the Q sources. Right? Now, there are some people who will use this to argue that the accounts in Acts is actually much more accurate than what Paul describes about himself in his account. Okay, a couple of strong points can be made here, or strong arguments can be made here. First things first, if we look at it from a lens whereby Paul is this person who is upset that he wasn't chosen to be the Messiah, and so he invent a story that Jesus actually came to him, gave him revelation, wahi, and now he preached the message of Jesus to all the communities around the Mediterranean. And so he sees himself as a prophet. He sees himself as someone who needs to assert authority like prophet does in the Old Testament, or even Jesus, right? Because there are theory whereby Paul actually was there during the persecution of Jesus according to the Christian narrative, right? But this has been disputed, and so we will not go there. So either way, Paul must have heard stories or narratives about Jesus. And so he must have also knew the prediction in the book of Isaiah, whereby, and the book of Daniel as well, the Son of Man, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, whereby he most probably he must have been very familiar with these scriptures, and in fact he was very familiar with the Hebrew Bible, so to speak, Hebrew Bible, and so he must have thought of himself as someone who should be the chosen one of God. But the fact that he wasn't, and the final Messiah to the Yahud, the Jews, was actually not him, but Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salam. And so he must have been very upset if we look at it from this angle. And so he came up with this very convincing story whereby he has received revelation that he actually went to persecute the people in Damascus, or on the way to persecute quote-unquote Christians in Damascus, and he did persecute Christians in Antioch or anywhere else. Right? He was very zealous for the law. Right? But because he wasn't the chosen Messiah, which he, growing up, reading the gospel, or reading the Septuagint, or reading the prophetic books, he must have been feeling very, very, he thought that he should be the chosen one of God. And the fact that he did not, he became very upset, and now he wants to actually flip or destroy the teachings of the final Messiah to the Yahuds, okay, the Jewish people. And so he invented the story whereby he received revelation wahi from the risen Lord, right? And so you know what else happened after that. And so Luke, the author of Luke, having two sources in front of him and probably aware of the stories, he rejected Paul's radicalizing ideas, right? Which is why he did not narrate a lot of the narratives that Paul mentions, in his own authentic letters. Right? The author of Luke Acts actually did not incorporate that in his book. Right? Why? Because Hengel made a point whereby Luke rejected all these ideas. And in fact, Luke stayed true to the teachings as narrated or as sent down by Q Gospel. In fact, a lot of scholars, for example, the late Professor Raymond Brown, the Roman Catholic priest, as well as other scholars, when we talk about the Q materials, the Q materials in Luke is actually much more trustworthy than the Q materials in Matthew. Why? Because Matthew's gospel actually follows 90% from Mark. And so there's a biasness towards the Pauline side. Right? But Luke's account, right, for example, doesn't have Jesus dying for your sins. Right? This is Luke's gospel doesn't have such method. Right? The reason that Jesus still died according to Luke's gospel, but the reason why he died wasn't for dying for the sins of other people, right? But the reason why he died is so that people make tawbah, teshuvah, right? They will return back, right? Their Messiah have been killed, and this should wake them up to return to the teachings of their Lord, the teachings of God, their Father, according to Christian tradition. And so, though in all Gospels Jesus died, but Jesus dying in Matthew, Mark, and John is different than why Jesus died in Luke. And so, we see here that on one side we have Matthew and Mark, and then on one side we have Luke and a much more authentic Q materials found in Luke. Right? And so now we have to answer the question, which account is actually earlier? Is it the Q material or is it the Pauline material? Which one is actually early? My opinion is that the Q materials are from a tradition that actually goes back to the teachings of Jesus, oral tradition. Whereas the Markan Matthean materials, which is basically Matthew followed Mark, and Mark had his own account, right? The M account or whatever you want to call it, actually goes back to Paul. Right? And Christian tradition, as narrated by the early church, Mark was a companion of Paul also. And also Mark was a companion of Peter. Right? And so, anyway, this is some interesting thoughts that I will leave you to decide for yourself. Anyway, my name is Arfat, and I'll see you in my next video. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.